Greetings from Union, West Virginia here in Monroe County. While here, see places such as Union, Sweet Springs, and Peterstown. We'll also speak with Fred Ziegler, former president of the Monroe County Historical Society, and he'll give us a detailed account of some of Monroe County's history and culture.
Monroe County is interesting because it is an area which is connected to the Great Valley of Virginia by pathways across the mountains. The Allegheny Mountains are a formidable barrier along much of the boundary between West Virginia and Virginia. They consist of very long, linear mountain chains which would be very difficult to cross even with modern roads. And so the early settlers were attracted to this area for a couple of reasons. One was accessibility through mountain passes along the drainage of the James River to the north and the New River to the south. The James River is a major, forms a major valley system that goes all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and that provided pathways for early settlers with their pack horses to come through the mountains. The New River is a very interesting river in that it flows not to the east and to the Atlantic, but to the north and west, to the Ohio Valley, ultimately to the Mississippi and to the Gulf of Mexico. So, but even so, the New River cuts through the mountains and makes for pathways through the mountains. The second thing that is important to know about Monroe County is that the farmland which exists here constitutes a larger proportion of the entire county than any other county in West Virginia. And the reason for that is that their limestone underlies this area, and it yields relatively level ground suitable for farming and relatively fertile soils, which of course also make it possible to grow the bluegrass and for feed for cattle and so forth. So this county was one of the early counties to be settled in what is now West Virginia. Of course, at that time, it was all part of Western Virginia. The early settlers started to come in the 1750s, and there was quite a bit of settlement at that time. However, relationships with the Native Americans were highly stressed, and the feelings were so strong during the French and Indian War in the 1750s and into the early 1760s that the settlers had to retreat across the mountains into what is now Virginia. And there were massacres at forts that were here on the Greenbrier River, and so that frightened people, and they moved back to the east. Subsequently, along about the 1770, relationships with the Native Americans was more positive, and settlers moved into this area again. Now, the reason they did that was because the farmland to the east, in the form of the Shenandoah Valley and further east still in Virginia, was being overpopulated. A lot of settlers were arriving from Europe, but more particularly there were large families that they had at the time produced a lot of children. So we had an expansion of the population, and they were looking for land. And so that's why the settlement of Monroe County. However, the settlers were not always kind to the Indians, and relationships deteriorated because some of the unruly settlers massacred Chief Logan's family along the Ohio River, and so although they had been initially friendly at that time, this caused a lot of hard feelings. In 1774, the colonists were told to build forts by Governor Dunmore, who was the last British governor of the state of Virginia. And there were about 24 forts that were established in this county and in the neighboring counties of Greenbrier and Pocahontas to help to protect the American colonists. Now, the early settlers to this part of the world were basically moving here from areas to the east, like the Shenandoah Valley, and further to the northeast in Pennsylvania. And they were what we call Scots-Irish. And the Scots-Irish were people that moved from Northern Ireland, but had their original origins in Scotland and the north of England. So in the 1600s, they were induced to move to Northern Ireland to start a farming life there from the northern part of the British Isles. And so they had been settled in Northern Ireland for roughly 100 years when they moved to North America around 1750, plus or minus 25 or 30 years. And their entry point was through Philadelphia and other ports in Pennsylvania. William Pitt in Pennsylvania was very interested in attracting colonists to the colony of Pennsylvania, and the Virginia governor was not perhaps so interested in this, but it resulted in a lot of people coming into southern Pennsylvania, and they eventually moved into the Shenandoah Valley and into West Virginia. So that ultimately the people that live around here were from Scotland and Northern Ireland and Northern England, and they brought with them their Presbyterian religion. The Methodist faith was being developed in England, and Bishop Asbury arrived in this county very early, just after the Revolutionary War, and founded the Rehoboth Church about 2 or 3 miles away from Union in Monroe County, West Virginia. And the church was built in, 1786 or so, and is still there. And it's a tourist attraction, and there's a full-time curator that lives there. The early Methodists in this part of the world were very evangelically inclined. That means that they moved out into the settlements, the sparse settlements here in West Virginia, and in fact they had what they called a circuit. Each minister had a circuit, and he would ride on his horse from place to place, and each day he would move. And then he would be in a different community the next day, and he would talk to the local people. So he would arrive, not, of course, on a Sunday necessarily, but on the day of the week that was included in his schedule. And he would hold church services in that particular community. And the circuit would last about 2 weeks, I believe, and then he would come back to where it started, and start all over again. In Greenville, the community that I live in, and I own the grist mill there, which was built by the Cook family. Two of the children of the Cook, two of the second generation, became Methodist evangelical preachers. And they had the area of Monroe County started out as a much larger county of Botetourt. And its courthouse was in Fincastle, Virginia, which is about a 2-hour drive from here. And it's across the Allegheny Mountains. So you can imagine in early times it was very inconvenient for the settlers to travel all the way across to the county seat, which they had to do from time to time if they wanted to attend the court, and if there were cases, arguments, they had to go all that distance. They really had to go all that distance to even sell their cattle and so forth. And so as time went on, the county were subdivided. Now, so we Monroe County here started out as a major part of Botetourt, but then subsequently, in 1780, Greenbrier County was separated from Botetourt, and we were part of Greenbrier County. And that situation existed for about 20 years until 1799, or right at the end of the 1700s. A separate county of Monroe was formed so that the boundary was established between here and what is still Greenbrier County. But so we were part of Greenbrier, but now Greenbrier got even smaller, and we formed the county that was with some modification confined to the boundaries, the political boundaries that we are today. After the Revolutionary War, settlement began again, and more people moved to the area of Monroe County, the new county that was formed in 1799. There were warm springs and mineral springs that were discovered in this county, and at that time, in the early 1800s, it was a very popular thing to develop resort areas around these springs. And so Monroe County had 3 major resorts, more than any other county around here. These were quite large, and with names like Sweet Springs and Salt Sulphur Springs and Red Sulphur Springs. They attracted people initially because of the promise that the springs had to cure illnesses like tuberculosis and other diseases. This was, again, before the time of modern medicine, and people came here to drink the mineral-rich waters of these springs, and also to bathe in them, and sometimes to do both. And they believed that that would cure what ailed them. Well, the other thing about coming to this area in West Virginia is that it is cooler here in the summer than in the large portions of the southeast part of our country. And so the temperatures here are 5 to 10 degrees cooler in the mountains, simply because of the fact that the elevations here are higher. And the higher the elevation, generally speaking, the cooler the climate. Now, you can imagine that living in the South before the days of air conditioning was not terribly pleasant in the summer, so that there was a great inducement to come into the mountains. The fact that the mineral springs here and the hot springs were here was a major inducement, and people just got into the habit of coming to the springs. And in those days, the families in the South were quite wealthy because they owned lots of slaves, and they would just have their slave masters keep the plantations during the summer, and the family would just move to the mineral springs in West Virginia. And they would spend about a week at Sweet Springs and a week at Red Sulphur Springs and a week at Salt Sulphur Springs, that sort of thing. And of course, it developed into a lot more than just the habit of bathing in the waters. There were other entertainments. There was dancing in the evenings, and you could go for carriage rides around the countryside, or just horseback rides were a very popular divergence. There was also playing cards and gambling and good food, and so the resorts were developed to the point where one could argue that Monroe County was the tourism capital of the South prior to the Civil War. Now, would you believe that here we are in a northern state, but that virtually all of the soldiers that fought from Monroe County in the Civil War went with the Confederacy? And that is also true of Greenbrier County to the north of here, and other of what we call the border counties, because we do border on Virginia and the Allegheny Mountains here. And somehow, and there are various explanations for this, the line separating Virginia, the southern state, from West Virginia, the northern state, was drawn that did not parallel the sympathies of the local people. And one of the reasons is that early on in the war, two governments were formed, one for each of the incipient state of West Virginia as well as Virginia, and the representatives that were elected from Greenbrier and from our county here of Monroe did not go to the government of what became West Virginia, but they went to Richmond instead. And, and so when the line was drawn, the representatives from this part of the world were nowhere near the debate. So the sympathies of Monroe County and other border counties went with the South, and this continued till well after the Civil War. So many of the young men and not so young men of this county went to fight for the Confederacy that there was no one to tend the farms and to keep the road system passable. And as time went on during the war, the economic conditions just got worse and worse and worse. So, and then of course, the final result was that the North defeated the South. So here we are in a county of West Virginia that fought for the South, but in a state which is nominally North. Even after the Civil War, you had to sign a loyalty oath to the Union, to the Northern government, saying that you supported the North during the Civil War, and there were so few people that could honestly say that they supported the Union. They were the only ones that were allowed to serve in government, local government positions. So it was a very tough time. Now, in terms of major battles that you read about in history books, we didn't have any, really. But we do have records of troop movements through this county, and particularly through the town of Union. After the Civil War, things were still pretty bad during early Reconstruction, but in the early 1870s, the railway was put through from Virginia through Lewisburg and Hampton and down the New River Valley. So basically it traversed the whole state, the whole new state of West Virginia. And that opened up the state to the economic developments that were occurring to the east and to the west. Now, in our county, they considered putting the railway, as they called it then, not a railroad, but now it's the same thing, of course. They considered putting the railway through this county, but instead it goes peripheral to the county. And what it meant was that you could harvest timber in this county, for instance, and move it to the local railheads that were not very far away. So there was that type of development that did occur. We did not have really much in the way of heavy industries that formed here. Railway had other effects too, and that is that it brought machinery to, that was produced in places like Roanoke and Salem, Virginia, to this part of the world. So if you owned a mill, for instance, as the type of property that I own now, instead of building your own mill machinery out of wood, which is what was done before the Civil War, after the railway got put in the again in the 1870s, you could import milling equipment that was made of steel, for instance, and it would have to be brought a fair distance by wagon, but still it was practical to do that. Now, in the 20th century, the Great Depression affected, of course, the whole country in profound ways. And actually, West Virginia, and particularly this agricultural part of West Virginia, was not as severely affected because it was basically a subsistence economy, and it did not depend on factories and employment and things like that, because everybody just grew their own food, and then they ate it. Now, the weather, like in other parts of the country, namely the Great Plains, was dry during the Great Depression, and so it did affect, of course, the agriculture to a certain extent. By that time, tourism was totally dead around here. As we've already said, in the 19th century, this area was the tourism capital of the world, first before the Civil War, and then after the Civil War. The patronage of the resorts increased to a certain extent after the Civil War, but it was based more on Northerners than on Southerners. And the railway had been brought in and had a direct connection with New York City. The fact that the railroad bypassed the county and ultimately the interstate and other four-lane roads bypassed Monroe County meant that the economy of the county never really developed very far beyond the agriculture that we have. Now, we've already discussed the fact that the agricultural land in the county is superb, so that the farming has been, of course, the mainstay of the county, and we still celebrate Farmers' Day in the first weekend of June here, and so it is a farming community. But we are off the beaten path, both in terms of the rail system and the road system, and this means that, this has a couple of meanings. It means that we've never really been developed in very far in the industrial sense, and but it also means that a lot of the older structures, like for instance the mills of the 19th century, have been preserved. They haven't been overbuilt, and this is what makes it attractive to some of us who like to to restore old buildings and so forth. There's plenty of that here, and old farms, and old carriages, and old wagons, and all of this has happily survived the 20th century, and now, of course, we're well into the 21st century.